Good day. I'm going to first of all start this program with a brief apology. I've been doing an awful lot of videos about the Ukrainian situation of late. I appreciate that many of you are probably becoming tired with this intricate and at the same time vexing subject, which is seemingly at an impasse and in deadlock. Nonetheless, I'm going to make this further program on that same topic because, of course, Ukraine is at the heart of the crisis, the larger crisis in relations between Russia and the West, which has been underway since 2014. Moreover, I am starting to sense that we may be close to a breakthrough which will not only see prospects of a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine end, but which may start to pave the way for a final and definite resolution of the crisis in eastern Ukraine shortly. Now, I'm going to come to that in a moment, but before I do, I want to say something about certain comments made by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in the United States on Sunday, before I deal with the more important points made by Vladimir Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, in Moscow. Now, Blinken, over the course of interviews, essentially said that the United States stands behind Ukraine, that its support for Ukraine is unfaltering, that Russia, if it takes any reckless steps, will face punishment by the United States for those steps. However, it was striking that Blinken gave no indication of what that punishment might be. And from his comments, I judged that the idea of deploying US troops to Ukraine has been categorically ruled out. And I also came away with the strong impression, that Zelensky's desperate calls for Ukraine to be fast-tracked into NATO have fallen on stony grounds. It seems at best what the United States will do if there is a war in Ukraine over the next few weeks is impose further sanctions on Russia. We've now seen many cycles of sanctions imposed on Russia. None of them have achieved anything very much, but some people in the United States seem to want to persist with them. I say that even though it's becoming increasingly clear that sanctions are ineffective. I would add, by the way, and just by way of parenthesis, that just a few weeks ago, we were reading in places like the New York Times that the United States was planning a massive a cyber attack on Russia in response to the SolarWinds hack, and that there would be more sanctions on Russia in response to alleged Russian interference in the November 2020 US presidential election. Well, what's become of all of this? I mean, weeks have passed and we've seen and heard nothing. Has that cyber attack actually taken place or not? Are those sanctions really going to be imposed? Well, we shall just have to wait and see. But one way or the other, it's very difficult to see exactly what more the United States can do on the sanctions front over and beyond what it has done already, which would not at the same time start to inflict real damage upon the global economy and by extension its own. I'm not going to discuss this topic further. I'm now going to go directly to Mr. Peskov and the very interesting things he said over the course of an interview which he gave to Russia's Russia 1 TV station. And what Mr. Peskov revealed is that the political advisors of Putin Chancellor Merkel of Germany, Emmanuel Macron of France, and Zelensky of Ukraine are now in regular contact, and they are discussing the setting up of a summit meeting which will bring all four of them together, where they will presumably talk about the situation, the current situation in eastern Ukraine. And Peskov made some really very interesting points. He said that this is a very difficult communication. It requires great patience of all four sides. Nevertheless, it is being conducted, and it is being conducted precisely in the interests and of preparing and holding such a summit. Then he actually discussed at some length some of the things that were said by the Russians and the French and the Germans to each other. First of all, he made it crystal clear that reports that have appeared in the Western media that Angela Merkel, over the discussion that took place with Putin over the telephone a few days ago, which I discussed in a recent video, that Angela Merkel in that discussion did not actually demand, as sections of the Western media have claimed, that Russia withdraw its troops from the Ukrainian border. In fact, the German readout does not mention any such demand. It does mention a request from Merkel, which was couched in terms of seeking a de-escalation of the situation in eastern Ukraine. And that is essentially what Peskov said. He says that Merkel addressed no demands of any kind to Putin. She basically instead sought his opinions and his views and his reassurances that there would be a de-escalation of the crisis within the next couple of days. In my opinion, the true purpose of this call, Merkel's call to Putin, as well as the previous discussion that took place between Merkel, Macron and Putin a week before, which I also discussed in a video, was to coordinate positions in advance of this very important summit, which is to include Zelensky, which is now in preparation. Anyway, on top of that, Peskov had some interesting things to say about the kind of things that the French and the Germans are saying to the Russians. He was asked, first of all, whether the Russians are coming under any pressure from the Germans and the French. And he said the following: "There are certain disagreements with us too, and there is a wish for us, as a party to the Minsk process, to show greater flexibility. But in general, there is understanding that there is a document that has no alternative at the moment which must be complied with. Everything is written in black and white, both the essence and the sequence of steps." What he is, of course, referring to here is the Minsk Agreement, agreed in Minsk in February 2015 by Ukraine and the leaders of the two Donbass republics, and brokered by Russia, Germany and France, which required Ukraine to negotiate a constitutional settlement in Ukraine directly with the leaders of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass. This is something which Ukraine has consistently and passionately refused to do. Peskov is saying that, in effect, the French and the Germans agree with the Russians that it is Ukraine that is reneging on its commitments under the Minsk Agreement, and that it is Ukraine that must now start to move. And indeed, that's exactly what he then goes on to say. Of course, when we hear Kiev statements more and more often and at various levels that the Minsk package of measures is already outdated, then this probably causes bewilderment, not only in our country, but also in Paris and Berlin. And then Peskov went on to make these really very remarkable observations about Ukraine. The Ukrainian side has been tenaciously trying to present Russia as a party to the Donbass conflict. Russia is not a party to the Donbass conflict. Russia is making every possible effort to help resolve this conflict, and we will tirelessly continue to clarify this. The Normandy Four members, except Ukraine, he means Germany and France, generally understand this. However, for them, probably Ukraine is such an enfant terrible. Yes, this terrible child, which you cannot kick out anywhere, but it causes a severe headache. Well, there we go. That's what Peskov and the Russians think the Germans and the French think about the Ukrainians. They think that the Ukrainians are a terrible child, an enfant terrible, which is not carrying out the commitments that it made in the February 2015 Minsk Agreement, which won't sit down and renegotiate as it committed itself to do with the leaders of the two Donbass republics, and which in consequence is perpetuating this crisis in Ukraine, which has become a crisis in relations between Russia and the West. And perhaps the single most important comment now that Peskov made over the course of his entire interview with Russia 1. And I don't here have his exact words, I only have a summary provided by the official Russian news agency TASS. And it reads as follows. The Kremlin spokesman, that's to say Peskov, emphasized that Moscow would insist on fulfilling at least some previous agreements in order to hold the new summit of the Normandy Four group. The Normandy Four group is the group which brings together Merkel, Putin, Macron and Zelensky in a single format where they all sit down and negotiate with each other. But the key words are these, that Moscow would insist on fulfilling at least some previous agreements in order to hold the new summit. That looks very much as if the Russians are telling the French and the Germans that there is the only point now in having a summit meeting is to force Ukraine or to persuade Ukraine to start taking serious steps towards fulfilling its commitments under the Minsk Agreement. In other words, talking with the two leaders of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass. Otherwise, this crisis will continue indefinitely, as it has done, with the risk of a flare-up in the conflict zone ever existing, and with the risk for the Germans and the French that if there is such a flare-up, Russia might intervene, causing the complete defeat of Ukraine's army, leading to the possible destruction of Ukraine, as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said, leading to the humiliation of Germany and France, and by extension of the West, and also leading to a possible irreparable breakdown in Russian EU relations, which it seems the Germans and the French, for all sorts of reasons, are extremely keen to avoid. So, that seems to be what the Russians are saying, and Peskov's other comments lead one to think that the French and the Germans are at least receptive to these comments or observations by the Russians, though whether they are prepared to put pressure on Ukraine to fulfill its commitments under the Minsk Agreement remains to be seen. I would add that with Merkel likely to quit or leave the political scene in Germany in September, something which he's promised to do, and with Macron in political trouble in France, it's just conceivable that the Ukrainians will ignore what Merkel and Macron are saying in the hope that whoever replaces them might be more sympathetic to Ukraine than they currently appear to be. Having said that, if that is the Ukrainian calculation, I anticipate that it would be a serious mistake. So it looks like a summit is now going to happen, or at least is being prepared and is most likely to happen. Zelensky himself, of course, as I discussed in a video I did a few days ago, is now increasingly talking about the need for a ceasefire. Other Ukrainian officials are doing the same. President Erdogan of Turkey, who is Zelensky's most vocal supporter, has also spoken about the need for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and for a peaceful resolution of the conflict there. So all of the indications seem to suggest that there's going to be a summit meeting, that a ceasefire is going to be agreed at that summit meeting. That will undoubtedly involve a mutual pullback of Ukrainian and Russian troops, and it will also apparently mean some pressure on Ukraine, some commitments from Ukraine to reactivate the Minsk process and to take some of the steps that Ukraine had committed itself to take as part of the Minsk process. Will this all happen? Well, we shall see. I think, firstly, the summit meeting is almost certain to happen. As Peskov says, negotiations are underway, and it looks as if that kind of that part of the summit meeting, a summit meeting of some kind, will take place, and I predict that it will indeed lead to a ceasefire and a mutual withdrawal of forces. Will there be further steps taken towards a actual settlement of the conflict via pressure on Ukraine to fulfill its part of the Minsk Agreement? Well, that is much more difficult. For Zelensky to open direct talks with the leaders of the two Donbass republics would invite a political storm in Ukraine. He is politically much weakened, and he must worry that if he were to take such a dramatic step, he might not survive it politically. Previous Ukrainian leaders, like Leonid Kuchma and Viktor Yanukovych, who have wanted to tilt more towards Russia, have found it impossible to do so because of the strength of nationalist opposition in Ukraine to such moves, and that opposition would double or treble if there was any talk of a negotiation with the leaders of the republics of the Donbass. In saying that, I should make it very clear that I think the vast majority of Ukrainians want peace, and the vast majority of Ukrainians would welcome such a negotiation. However, it's not the vast majority of Ukrainians I'm talking about. It is those Ukrainians who are involved in politics, who are committed to the vision of a independent nationalist Ukraine, independent and in some ways in conflict with Russia, who would undoubtedly mobilize, as they have done in the past, to block any move of that nature if Zelensky were to take it. However, I do also get the sense, and this is a strong sense, and I think it goes beyond Merkel and Macron, and which is reflected in Peskov's words, that the French and the Germans, and indeed the Europeans generally, are now absolutely sick and tired and exhausted of this unending Ukrainian crisis. From their point of view, it has brought them nothing but trouble. Ukraine has become a black hole into which they throw money. It has failed to be the great geopolitical success story that they imagined or expected it would be, and it has wrecked their relations with Russia at a time when it seems that they're once again thinking about taking some kind of steps towards improving those relations. So logically, the Germans and the French and many other European countries also would want to see this crisis in Ukraine end and resolve itself so that they can finally move forward to patch up relations with Russia and to bring this conflict in Ukraine to an end. Whether that will amount to Merkel and Macron screwing themselves up to the point where they can actually bring real pressure to bear on Ukraine to settle this conflict once and for all is another matter. It doesn't seem that Ukraine is getting much in the way of support from the United States, judging from what Blinken was saying. Whether the French and the Germans, however, are prepared to take the plunge, face what would undoubtedly be a row, not just with the United States, but with countries like Poland and Britain and the Baltic states also, is another matter. I think we are getting close to that point. Perhaps we are not quite there. But this summit meeting, if it takes place, judging from the things that Peskov says, may be a step in that direction. We shall see. Thank you for joining me for this long and tangled program on this difficult and dense subject. Please check me out for the other programs I do with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on our main channel at the Duran. Please also check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please support us through our various platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. And to the extent that you can, support us also via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Again, links under this video. And please remember, we accept donations in all currencies, including the new ones, including ones like Bitcoin, for example, though I would be surprised, obviously, given the current movements of the currency markets, if Bitcoin were the form of any of your donations. And last but not least, please don't forget to check out our shop. The wonderful things you will find there: our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hats, our hoodies, and our famous magic mugs. Thank you for bearing with me through this long program. I look forward to you joining me on further programs on this channel. And until then, have a wonderful day.